The town of Ashton runs on routine. Boots on dirt roads, wagons creaking past a mine, the same faces at the saloon every night. Then one day, 3 miners don't come back. Liam, Joshua, Simon. No goodbye, no luggage, no trail into the hills. Their cabin sits at the edge of town with the door locked from the inside, windows shut, and floorboards nailed down so tight that it looks freshly cut. The sheriff checks the mine tunnels, the creek beds, the forest line. Nothing. By sundown, the search turns into arguments, whispers, and locked eyes across the street. The small mining town of Ashton had always carried a certain stillness, an unsettling calm that settled into its air like dust on old books. Its streets were quiet, save for the clang of pickaxes and the rumble of the occasional wagon hauling the fruits of his labor from the earth. But in 1884, something fractured that stillness. Something vanished. The 3 miners, Liam, Joshua, and Simon, had become fixtures in Ashton. Each man had lived through hardships, and each had felt the weight of time pressed down on their shoulders. Their lives, though full of dust and sweat, were relatively simple, or so it seemed. It was a typical day when they disappeared. No warning, no sign of struggle. In the morning, they had walked into town, but by the evening, they had become whispers. Gone. Vanished. In the heart of Ashton, the miners were more than just laborers. They were seen as steadfast men, reliable and trusted. They had shared many a drink at the local saloon, laughing and talking about their work, the land, the future. They were part of the fabric of the town, a town that built itself on its laborers' blood, sweat, and backbreaking efforts. But then, on that fateful day, they simply ceased to exist. No one knew where they went. No one knew what had happened. The cabin they had been staying in was found locked from the inside. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that anything had been disturbed. The floorboards of the cabin had been carefully sealed, as though the room had been deliberately closed off from the world, shut away to keep whatever was inside from ever being seen again. It was strange at first, the absence. People went about their lives, but something felt off. The town began to buzz with rumors, theories, and suspicions. Liam, Joshua, and Simon were men of routine. They would never have just wandered off. They were always predictable in their habits. But now, predictability had been shattered. There were whispers that maybe the men had left to escape some debt, to run away from something they had done. But none of that felt right. They had no enemies, no reason to disappear into thin air. They had been happy. Or had they? The cabin was at the edge of town, far from the prying eyes of the more social areas. It had once been the perfect retreat for weary miners, a small wooden structure with nothing but a stove, a few chairs, and a table, the sort of place where men could rest, drink their coffee in peace, and gather their thoughts after long days in the mines. But now it was a place of mystery, and no one could quite figure out why. Had the men stumbled upon something they shouldn't have? Had they uncovered a secret buried beneath the town, beneath the very land they had been mining? The town of Ashton had always been tight-knit, its people trusting one another. There were no real enemies in Ashton, at least none that could be seen. And yet, the unexplained disappearance of 3 men felt like an intrusion into that calm, a disruption that none could easily swallow. As days passed and the local authorities turned over every stone, the mystery only deepened. No one could make sense of it. What was even more unsettling was the fact that the cabin had been locked from the inside. The door was fastened shut, as though whoever had been inside had never intended to leave. There was no sign of a forced entry, no broken windows or splintered wood to suggest a struggle. It was as if the men had simply vanished into the air, leaving nothing behind but their empty beds and a lingering, suffocating silence. The floorboards, sealed tightly, suggested that someone or something had gone to great lengths to keep the cabin closed off from the rest of the world. But why? What was inside that cabin that was so important, so secret, that it had to be locked away forever? It wasn't long before people started talking. The men had been seen leaving the saloon the night before their disappearance, laughing, joking, and in high spirits. It seemed so normal, so utterly mundane. And yet, there was a feeling in the air that something more had been happening just beneath the surface, something no one had dared to speak of. The town of Ashton was old, founded decades ago by a group of men who had promised to carve their futures from the unforgiving land. But over time, that promise had morphed into something darker, something hidden from a view of the outside world. Ashton was built on a pact, one that had been forged in the town's early days, long before the miners had arrived. No one spoke of it. It was one of those things that had simply been accepted, a truth no one bothered to question. But now, with the miner's sudden disappearance, the silence surrounding that pact seemed to reverberate louder than ever. People had whispered about it in hushed tones for years. There had been rumors about the land being cursed, about the earth demanding its price, about strange things happening in the dead of night. But those rumors had never amounted to anything tangible, nothing anyone could point to and say, "This is what's causing it all." Yet now, with the disappearance of Liam, Joshua, and Simon, the town began to wonder, had the pact they had all unwittingly entered into somehow come to claim its due? Was this the price for years of mining, for plundering the earth's treasures without offering anything in return? Had these three men, in their search for something deeper, found the very heart of that dark agreement? The sealed cabin seemed to offer the first tangible clue, but no one dared to look too closely. No one dared to open that door again. The town was changing, and the feeling of unease was growing. People started to look at each other with suspicion, as though the truth was out there, lurking just beyond the edges of their vision, waiting to be revealed. But no one wanted to be the one to uncover it. No one wanted to be the person to open that door, to peer into the unknown. Everyone had their own theories, their own explanations, but deep down, they all feared the same thing, that the disappearance of three miners was not a random tragedy, but something far more deliberate. The town of Ashton had secrets, old secrets, buried deep in the earth and even deep in the hearts of those who called it home. And as time passed, those secrets began to claw their way to the surface. The questions remained unanswered. Where had the men gone? What had they found? And what was hidden beneath the floorboards of that sealed cabin? No one knew, but one thing was certain. Ashton would never be the same again. It would be forever marked by the day the miners vanished, by the mystery that lingered in the air like smoke. And as the town held its breath, waiting for the truth to surface, a deeper question began to haunt them. Was this just the beginning of something much darker? The search for the miners was called off after several weeks, but the town could not move on. The sealed cabin became a place of endless speculation, a symbol of the unsettling mystery that had gripped Ashton. The men had been lost to the earth, but the truth, the real truth, had yet to be unearthed. And in the silence of that cabin, with the locked door and the sealed floorboards, the heart of the town's darkest secret continued to beat, waiting for someone brave enough to face it. The cabin stood at the outskirts of Ashton, its walls worn and weathered by years of harsh winds and the incessant passage of time. It was once a place of simple refuge, a retreat from the grueling hours spent laboring the mines that carved the very bones of the earth. The miners would return from the depths, their faces lined with dust, their bodies bent with exhaustion, and they would find solace here. There was nothing grand about the cabin. A small structure with a dirt floor, a single stove, and a few wooden chairs arranged in a circle. It was a space for men to gather their thoughts, sip warm coffee, and share stories of the world above and below the earth. But now, the cabin had become something else entirely. It had become a tomb, a sealed monument to a mystery that no one could explain. When the miners, Liam, Joshua, and Simon vanished, the cabin became the epicenter of the town's growing unease. The townspeople, who had long seen the cabin as little more than a place to store tools and catch a few hours of rest, now saw it as a grim symbol of something darker, a place where the answers to their questions might lie. But no one was eager to look too closely. No one was willing to breach the sealed silence that surrounded it. The door had been locked from the inside, and the floorboards, which once creaked with the weight of the men who had stayed there, had been tightly sealed. It was as though the cabin itself had conspired to shut out the world, to keep whatever secrets it held buried beneath its floor. The town of Ashton had always been a place of hard work and simple pleasures. It was a town built on the backs of men like Liam, Joshua, and Simon, men who had come to the area in search of opportunity, and found it in the deep veins of gold hidden in the earth. They had toiled in the mines for years, carving their way through the rock, bringing forth the riches that sustained the town. There were no great luxuries in Ashton, no grand celebrations or lavish estates. It was a place where people knew the value of a day's labor and the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. But the disappearance of the miners shattered that simplicity. It was as if the town's very foundation had cracked, revealing something ancient and sinister lurking beneath. The sealed cabin was the first clue, the first indication that something was terribly wrong. The townspeople had seen the cabin before. Everyone had passed it on their way into town or out to the mines. It was an old structure, but was familiar, a part of the landscape, like the trees and the hills that surrounded it. It was just a cabin, after all, or so they had thought. But now, with the miners missing and the strange circumstances surrounding their disappearance, the cabin took on a new meaning. It became a symbol of the unknown, a place that seemed to hold the answers to a question no one wanted to ask. The local sheriff, a man named Benjamin, was the first to investigate the cabin. He had known the miners for years. They were good men, hard-working, reliable. They weren't the type to just disappear. But when he arrived at the cabin, the sight before him only deepened the mystery. The door, once so inviting and easy to open, was now locked from the inside. Benjamin had no way of knowing how it had been sealed shut. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that anyone had tried to escape. It was as if the miners had simply vanished. He pushed open the door, his hand shaking with anticipation. But when he stepped inside, he was met with silence, a silence that seemed to hang heavy in the air. The cabin was undisturbed, except for one thing: the floorboards. The floorboards had been sealed. The wooden planks, which had once creaked and groaned beneath the weight of men, were now nailed shut with eerie precision. There was something almost unnatural about the way the nails had been hammered in, as though they were meant to keep something hidden beneath them. The sheriff bent down to examine the planks, his breath catching in his throat. He knew the miners had been staying there, but the sight of the sealed floorboards made it clear that something had gone terribly wrong. But what? What could have happened in this small, quiet cabin that would cause the men to vanish without a trace? Benjamin couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine as he stood there, staring at the floor. There was a story here, something buried deep beneath the wood, but he couldn't quite grasp it. He had heard the rumors, of course, the whispers about the town's past, the strange occurrences that had been chalked up to superstition and old wives' tales. There had always been talk of something dark beneath the surface of Ashton, something tied to the land itself. But no one had ever paid those stories much mind. They were just that, stories, old legends passed down through generations, meant to scare children into obedience, not facts that anyone took seriously. And yet, standing in the silence of that cabin, Benjamin couldn't shake the feeling that the stories weren't just tales. They were warnings. The sheriff's investigation didn't go much further that day. The sealed floorboards remained untouched. He tried to pry them up, but the nails held fast, as if resisting his every attempt. There was something deliberate in the way they had been fastened, something purposeful, as though the person who had sealed them knew exactly what they were doing. There was no evidence to suggest foul play, no signs of violence or struggle. The miners had simply vanished, and the only clue left behind was this strange, sealed cabin. As days turned into weeks, the town's anxiety only deepened. More people started to talk. The cabin became the subject of hushed conversations, whispered theories, and pointed glances. What was hidden beneath those floorboards? Was it something the miners had discovered? Something they had stumbled upon that they were never meant to find? The questions began to swirl around Ashton like a storm, each one more unsettling than the last. The town's historian, a quiet man named Samuel, began to pore over old records and documents, searching for any mention of the cabin or its origins. What he found was troubling. The cabin had been built nearly a century ago, in the early days of Ashton's founding. It had been constructed by a group of men who were said to have struck a deal with the land, a deal that guaranteed the prosperity of the town in exchange for something. What that something was, no one seemed to know, but there were whispers, old rumors that spoke of a pact, a bargain made with the earth itself. Some said it was a sacrifice. Others claimed it was a promise made in the dead of night, sealed with blood. But no one could say for sure. The details were lost to time, buried under layers of secrecy and fear. As Samuel dug deeper, he found more evidence that pointed to something far darker than anyone had ever imagined. The miners had been investigating the cabin in the days before their disappearance. They had found something beneath the floorboards, something that seemed to tie the past to the present in a way no one had anticipated. The sealed floorboard were not just a physical barrier. They were a symbol of something far more insidious. The cabin had been sealed to protect a secret that the miners had come too close to uncovering. The more Samuel uncovered, the more the town began to change. People grew nervous, casting furtive glances at one another, as if expecting the truth to reveal itself at any moment. The town had always been small, isolated, but now it felt suffocating. No one spoke openly about the Pact, but it lingered in the air like a cloud, heavy and oppressive. Everyone felt it, but no one dared to acknowledge it. The sealed cabin had become a symbol of that unspoken truth, a reminder that some things were better left untouched. And yet, despite the fear, there were those who couldn't let go of the mystery. They couldn't ignore the nagging questions that plagued their minds. What had happened to the miners? What had they discovered? And what, if anything, did the sealed floorboards have to do with it? The town of Ashton had always been a place of hard work, of simple men doing their best to make a living. But now, it seemed as though they were all caught in the web of something much larger, something that had been woven long before they had arrived. The sealed cabin remained untouched, its floorboards still locked away beneath layers of nails. The town waited, and the mystery grew. The more time passed, the more the unanswered questions gnawed at the edges of Ashton's quiet existence. Something was hidden beneath the cabin, something that had been buried for generations, and the miners had been the ones to uncover it. But now, with their disappearance, the town was left to wonder, had they uncovered something they shouldn't have? And what would happen if the truth were ever revealed? The sealed floorboards were the only clue, but no one knew how to open them. No one knew how to unlock the past. As the days passed in Ashton, the sense of unease began to grow like a slow, creeping fog. The disappearance of Liam, Joshua, and Simon was not the sort of thing that could be easily dismissed. At first, people tried to continue their routines, returning to mines, tending to their families, and going about their work as if nothing had changed. But something was different. There was an unspoken weight in the air, a tension that seemed to hang over the town like a heavy cloud. People couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that the men hadn't just vanished. They had been taken, or perhaps had stumbled upon something they shouldn't have. It wasn't long before the town's old stories began to surface once again. Tales that had long been buried, whispered in hushed tones by the elders and dismissed as superstition by the younger generations. But now, with the miners' disappearance hanging over the town like a dark omen, those old stories started to take on a different meaning. The town, it seemed, had always been a place of secrets. There were things that no one spoke about, things that were simply too unsettling to acknowledge. Yet now, those things began to resurface, like forgotten memories clawing their way to surface. The elders of Ashton, those who had lived there since the town's founding, were the first to speak up. They had seen things, heard things that didn't fit into the neat, tidy narrative of the town's history. In private conversations, they began to share fragments of those stories with anyone who would listen. These were stories that had been passed down for generations, stories that had always been treated with suspicion and avoided by most. But now, with the miners' disappearance still fresh in everyone's minds, those stories began to make sense in ways that they hadn't before. One of the first tales that resurfaced was about the land itself, the land that Ashton had been built on. The town had been founded during a time of great hardship, when settlers had arrived in search of new opportunities, only to find themselves struggling against an unforgiving wilderness. They had come to the area hoping to find riches in the earth, to carve a living from the mountains and streams that surrounded them. But what they found was something much darker, something that couldn't be explained by mere fortune. The land, it seemed, had its own rules, its own demands, and it claimed the lives of those who didn't respect them. The early settlers, so the story went, had made a pact with the land. They had struck a deal with the earth, promising it something in exchange for prosperity. What that something was, no one could say for sure. Some believed that it was a sacrifice, a payment that had to be made in blood. Others claimed that it was a promise, an unspoken agreement that bound the people of Ashton to land in ways they didn't fully understand. Whatever the truth was, one thing was certain. The pact had been made, and it had shaped the town's destiny. Over the years, the details of the pact had become increasingly obscure by time, fear and the need for survival. Those who had come before had been careful to keep the truth hidden, to bury it deep within the town's history. They had tried to erase the memory of what had been done, but the land remembered. The earth, it seemed, never forgot. And when the miners had arrived with their tools and their ambitions, they had unknowingly disturbed something that had been sleeping for decades. The first hint that something was wrong had come long before the miners' disappearance. There had always been rumors, little whispers in the corners of the town, about strange occurrences, about people who had disappeared without a trace, about sudden tragedies that seemed to strike without warning. Some claimed that these were just accidents, unfortunate happenstances that happened to befall the unlucky, but others weren't so sure. There were those who believed that the land was exacting its price, collecting what was owed to it. And now, with the disappearance of Liam, Joshua, and Simon, it seemed that those old stories were no longer just folklore. They were becoming something far more real, something that couldn't be ignored. In the weeks following the miners' disappearance, the town's mood shifted. People began to look at one another differently, as though they were seeing each other for the first time. There was a growing sense of suspicion, a quiet fear that spread through the community like an illness. The town, which had once been a place of relative peace and simplicity, had become a powder keg, with each passing day bringing more questions and answers. What was hidden beneath the town's surface? What had the miners discovered in that sealed cabin, in those sealed floorboards? The townspeople began to wonder if the miners had found something they weren't meant to see, something that had been buried for years. But no one dared to speak of it openly. There was a palpable fear in the air, a hesitation to confront the truth, whatever it might be. The older residents, those who had grown up with the town's secrets, spoke in hushed tones, as though afraid that speaking the words aloud would bring them to life. The younger generation, meanwhile, remained largely oblivious to the rumors that surrounded them, content with their work in the mines and their lives in town. But even they couldn't ignore the growing tension. The town was changing, and they could feel it in their bones. As the days turned into weeks, a strange sort of silence fell over Ashton. The once bustling streets became quieter, the air heavier. People no longer greeted one another with the same warmth. Instead, there was a distant quality to their interactions, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The saloon, which had once been a place of laughter and camaraderie, now felt like a place of mourning, where the regular patrons sat in silence, nursing their drinks, exchanging worried glances. No one was sure what they were waiting for, but everyone could sense that the town was on the edge of something. The town's collective fear grew as the rumors continued to spread. Each person seemed to have their own version of the truth, their own theory about what had happened to miners and what the sealed floorboards in the cabin meant. Some believed that the miners had uncovered evidence of the Pact, that they had found something beneath the earth that they were never meant to see. Others feared that the town's past was catching up with them, that the price of prosperity was finally coming due. The fact that the miners had been the ones to uncover this secret was especially unsettling, because if anyone had known too much, it was them. They had spent countless hours in the mines, had been the ones to dig deeper into the earth than anyone before them. And now they were gone, vanished. Was it because they had discovered something they shouldn't have? It wasn't just the miners who had disappeared. Something in Ashton itself had changed. The once familiar landscape now felt foreign, as though the very earth had shifted beneath the town's feet. The land was no longer a source of sustenance and prosperity. It had become something else entirely. The Pact, whatever it had been, had become an anchor around the town's neck, a weight that no one could escape. People began to question whether the town could ever truly be free of its past, whether it could ever escape the grip of whatever had been set in motion long ago. In the midst of the growing fear and suspicion, one thing became clear. Ashton was not just a town with history. It was a town trapped in that history, bound to it in ways no one fully understood. And as long as the town remained, the past would continue to haunt it, lingering just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface. The sealed floorboards in the cabin were a physical manifestation of that truth, a reminder that there were things in Ashton that no one could ever escape, things that would always be lurking just beneath the earth. The air in Ashton had become thick with unspoken words, with secrets long buried beneath layers of dust and time. The townspeople could feel it, a collective unease, a tension that gripped the very soul of the place. The sealed cabin, now the center of all attention, held within its walls a mystery that no one dared fully acknowledge, let alone attempt to unravel. The disappearance of the three miners, Liam, Joshua, and Simon, was no longer just a tragic accident or an inexplicable event. It had become the town's living nightmare. It was clear that the answer to their fate lay somewhere deep within the earth, beneath the very land that had given life to Ashton. Ashton had always been a town of survivors. The people were tough, resilient, shaped by the harsh realities of mining life. They had carved out an existence in the shadow of the mountains, extracting the riches of the land with their blood, sweat, and toil. But all of that had come at a cost. The stories, once dismissed as idle gossip, now seemed to carry weight. And the town's history, with its secrets, its whispers, and its hidden pacts, was being called into question like never before. Beneath the surface of the everyday, there was something dark, something sinister that had always been there, lying in wait. And the miners had found it. The Pact, as the elders spoke of it, had been made long before any of the current generation had arrived in Ashton. It was said to have been forged during the town's earliest days, when the settlers, starving and desperate, had struck a deal with the land itself. At the time, Ashton was little more than a collection of rough cabins, a place where survival came first and everything else came second. The mountains that loomed above them seemed to offer promise, but there was danger beneath their beauty, unseen forces, ancient and powerful, that had claimed the lives of those who had come before. The settlers, desperate for a way to endure the harsh winters and barren landscape, had sought something more. They needed a promise, something to ensure their survival, something to guarantee that their town would thrive. And so the pact was made. Some believed it was a simple agreement with the earth, an offering in exchange for prosperity. Others spoke of a more sinister arrangement, one that involved blood, sacrifice, and a price that no one could fully understand. Over the years, the details of the pact had been forgotten, lost to time. But the consequences of that ancient deal had always remained, festering in the shadows, lurking beneath the town's seemingly peaceful exterior. As the elders told their stories, a sense of dread began to settle over Ashton. These were not just idle tales. They were warnings that had been passed down through generations, carried on the breath of those who had survived, who had witnessed the cost of the pact and its far-reaching consequences. But the townspeople, caught in their daily struggles, had never fully understood the weight of those warnings. The pact had been something distant, something irrelevant to their lives. But now, with the disappearance of the miners, it was becoming clear that the pact was far from distant. It was right in front of them. It was buried beneath the cabin, beneath the very land they called home. Samuel, the town's historian, had been one of the first to connect the dots. He had always been a quiet man, a thinker, one who spent more time in the dusty corners of the town's archives than in the company of others. But as the mystery deepened, he found himself drawn into the enigma of the miners' disappearance. He began to search through the old records, scouring documents that had long been forgotten, hoping to find some clue, some trace of the pact that had been made so many years ago. It wasn't long before he stumbled upon something strange, an old, tattered journal, its pages yellow with age, its leather cover cracked and worn. The journal belonged to one of the town's original settlers, a man named Elias Blackwood. Elias Blackwood, it turned out, had been one of the signatories of the pact, one of the men who had made the deal with the land in exchange for the town's prosperity. The journal was filled with cryptic entries, written in a hand that trembled with fear. Elias spoke of the pact in vague terms, hinting at something dark and malevolent that had been awakened by the settlers' actions. He wrote of strange happenings, of an ancient force that seemed to watch over town, of unexplained disappearances and inexplicable deaths. At first, Elias had dismissed these occurrences as mere superstition, anxiety brought on by the harshness of life in the wilderness. But as time went on, the things he witnessed began to shake his faith in his own understanding of the world. In the journal, Elias described a strange occurrence that had taken place one winter's night, shortly after the pact had been made. He and several other men had ventured out into the woods to cut wood for the coming winter. But when they returned, one of their number was missing. The man had been taken by something that none of them could explain. It was not an animal, nor a man. It was something else, something ancient, something that had been lying dormant beneath the earth for centuries. And now it had awoken. The more Samuel read, the more he felt the weight of the town's past bearing down on him. He began to understand that the Pact had not just been a simple agreement. It had been a binding contract, one that tied the town to something far darker than anyone had realized. The land itself seemed to hold a terrible power, a power that demanded payment, and the miners, in their search for gold, had unknowingly awakened something that should have remained undisturbed. The sealed cabin, with its locked door and its nailed-down floorboards, was the first physical manifestation of that awakening. The miners had come too close to the truth, and in doing so, they had paid the price. But it wasn't just the miners who had paid. The town of Ashton, from the moment the pact had been made, had been living on borrowed time. Each generation had made its own sacrifices, had given its own offerings to the land to ensure that the prosperity continued. Some of the offerings were small: cattle, crops, goods. Others were more significant: lives, blood, and souls. Over the years, the townspeople had come to accept these sacrifices as a part of life, something that had to be done in order for the town to survive. But the miners had stumbled upon the truth, and now the town was at the mercy of forces it didn't fully understand. Samuel's discovery sent ripples through the town. At first, only a few people knew about the journal and its contents, but as the days passed, the word spread and the whispers grew louder. The elders, who had long known about the pact, were the first to react. They tried to dismiss Samuel's findings, to convince the townspeople that it was all just an old man's ramblings, nothing more than an overactive imagination. But the seed had been planted, and the people of Ashton began to ask themselves questions they had never dared ask before. Was the town really cursed? Had the pact really tied them to something so dark, so insidious that it could claim the lives of those who sought to disturb it? And if that was the case, what had become of the miners? Had they paid the price for uncovering the truth, for bringing the town's darkest secret into the light? Ashton was never the same after Samuel's discovery. The once peaceful town was now a place of fear and uncertainty, where people no longer trusted their own neighbors, and where the past seemed to rise up like a storm, threatening to consume them all. The sealed cabin became a focal point of that fear, a symbol of the danger that lay beneath the surface. The townspeople no longer saw the cabin as a simple structure. It had become a tomb, a crypt that held the town's darkest secrets, a place that no one dared to approach. For the first time in years, the land of Ashton felt alien. The mountains, which had once seemed so steady, so reassuring, now loomed above the town like silent sentinels, watching, waiting. The earth itself seemed to hum with a strange energy, a force that the townspeople had long ago chosen to ignore, but which now felt as if it were closing in on them. And the question that haunted everyone was the same: had the miners truly uncovered something that was never meant to be found? And if so, what would happen next? Would the town finally pay the price for its dark pact, or would they find a way to break free of the land's grip before it was too late? As the days turned to weeks, the town of Ashton became increasingly consumed by fear, as if the very earth beneath their feet was pressing in on them, tightening its grip. The miners, Liam, Joshua, and Simon, were not just missing. Their disappearance had cast a dark shadow over the entire town, turning every street, every corner, every whisper into a reminder of something that was beyond understanding. For those who had known the men, their absence was not just a loss of life. It was a deep, unsettling fracture in the town's sense of reality. And with that fracture came a new truth, one that no one wanted to face, but which grew harder and harder to ignore. Ashton was a town bound by something ancient and terrifying, and the pact made by the first settlers, long forgotten, was still very much in force. The sealed cabin had become the center of the town's anxiety, the place where the mystery of the miners' fate began to converge with the ancient truths that had once been hidden. Every day, more people gathered outside the cabin, drawn by a mixture of fear and curiosity. They spoke in hushed tones, glancing nervously at the door, as if hoping that someone would finally step forward to reveal what had happened behind those sealed floorboards. But no one dared enter. The air around the cabin was thick with unspoken dread, as if the land itself had drawn a line in the sand, warning anyone who came too close. Samuel, the town historian, had become the reluctant keeper of the truth. His discovery of the journal had changed everything. Once a man content to live quietly in the background, Samuel now found himself at the center of a storm. The journal of Elias Blackwood had provided the key to understanding the town's cursed history, and yet As much as the facts seemed to point to the same conclusion, Samuel was reluctant to believe it. The details in Elias's writings, his descriptions of strange occurrences, of things seen and heard in the dead of night, of people disappearing without a trace, were terrifying, yes, but they were also written in a time so distant, in a world so foreign to Samuel that he could scarcely imagine it. Yet the more he read, the more he realized that the town had always known something was wrong. There had always been a price, but no one had ever questioned it too closely. The pact, it seemed, had been made with something far older than anyone had ever guessed. It wasn't just a land that was cursed, but something that lay beneath the earth itself, a force, perhaps, or an entity, something that had been awakened when the settlers first struck their bargain with the earth. The town had flourished, but in exchange for its prosperity, it had given up more than just material offerings. There had been lives lost, disappearances that had never been fully explained, sacrifices made in the dead of night, away from the prying eyes of the rest of the town. Over the years, the details of the pact had been lost, swept under the rug, buried by time. But now, it seemed, the consequences of those long-forgotten promises were being felt. Samuel's unease grew as he spent more time poring over the journal. It seemed to him that Elias Blackwood had known the price would one day come due. The man's fear was palpable in his writing, as if he had come to realize that the land was not something to be tamed, not something to be conquered. It was alive in some way, and it would exact its price when the time came. The settlers had made a deal, yes, but it was a deal with something that had been lying dormant for centuries. And now, with the miners having disturbed the sealed cabin, it felt as if the time had finally arrived. In the days following his discovery, Samuel grew more and more withdrawn. He tried to share his findings with the town, but the reactions were mixed. Some people listened, but most of them dismissed it as nothing more than folklore, ancient stories that had no bearing on their lives today. But Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that the town was spiraling towards something inevitable, something dark and unavoidable. He began to feel as if he were standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into an abyss, knowing that the only way forward was through it. It was around this time that the strange events began to escalate. It started slowly, small things at first, subtle shifts that might have been overlooked if the town hadn't been so on edge. People began to report strange noises at night. Footsteps, whispers, something moving just out of sight. At first, these were dismissed as figments of imagination, brought on by fear and anxiety. But then the occurrences became harder to explain away. Windows that had been left open were found closed in the morning, as if someone had been inside. Objects in homes were moved, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in ways that suggested a deliberate hand. The townspeople began to speak of the land itself as if it had become a living thing, alive with an energy that was far from natural. One night, a young woman named Clara, who lived on the outskirts of town, came rushing into the saloon, pale and trembling. She spoke in frantic, fragmented sentences, barely able to catch her breath. She had been walking home when she heard something. No, someone calling her name from the woods. At first, she thought it was just the wind, or perhaps an animal. But then, the voice became clearer, more distinct. It was a voice she recognized, a voice she had heard only days before, one of the miners, Joshua, calling her name. But when she turned to look, no one was there. The woods were silent. Clara's story spread like wildfire through the town, fueling the growing sense of dread. If Joshua's voice had truly called her from the woods, then where was he? If the miners were still alive, if they had somehow returned, why had no one seen them? But as the days passed, no one else heard the voice. No one else saw the figure. It was as if the very earth itself had swallowed the miners whole, and yet they had not truly disappeared. They were there, somewhere just beyond the veil, caught between this world and something else. The following week, the town was hit by another strange occurrence. Several families reported seeing figures at the edges of the woods, standing just beyond the tree line, watching the town with unsettling stillness. No one could get close enough to identify the figures, but their presence was unmistakable, and there was something about them that felt wrong, unnatural. Their movements were jerky, disjointed, as if they were being controlled by some unseen force. Some said they looked like the miners. Others swore they saw figures that were nothing like anyone they had ever seen before. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface of Ashton finally erupted. Rumors began to swirl that the miners had not truly disappeared, that they had somehow returned, changed. Some said they had made a deal with whatever force lived beneath the earth, that they had somehow become part of it, no longer human but something else entirely. Others whispered that the Pact had claimed them, that they were the price the town had to pay for its prosperity. And still others insisted that the miners had discovered the secret of the sealed cabin, had uncovered something so terrible, so ancient, that they had been absorbed into it. Trapped between the world of the living and the world of the dead, Ashton had always been a town of survivors, but now it felt as if the very land was turning against them. There was no safe place, no sanctuary. The townspeople could no longer trust their own eyes, their own senses. The boundary between the real and the unreal had begun to blur. The sealed cabin, the very heart of the mystery, became a symbol of the growing darkness. Everyone knew the answers lay inside, beneath those sealed floorboards, but no one dared to open them. The price of knowledge seemed too high, and yet the fear of not knowing was worse. The voices of the miners, whether real or imagined, continued to haunt the town. Some swore they could hear them in the wind. Others claimed to hear them in the creak of old wood at night. The land had a life of its own, and it seemed to be calling to them, drawing them toward the truth. But the truth was something no one was prepared to face. In the end, it became clear to Samuel and to many others that Ashton was no longer a town like any other. It was a town marked by its history, by its pact with the earth, by its refusal to acknowledge the truth. The town's future seemed uncertain, its very existence in jeopardy. There was a sense that the land had not simply given to the town. It had taken something in return. And now, as the town stood at the edge of a precipice, it seemed that the price had finally come due. The sealed cabin was the key, but unlocking it would not provide the closure they hoped for. Whatever lay beneath those floorboards would be far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. And perhaps, just perhaps, the only thing left to do was to leave the past buried and hope that whatever darkness had been unleashed would recede into the shadows, never to return. The tension in Ashton had reached a boiling point, and the town, once a place of quiet routine, was now a place on the edge of panic. Every whisper, every glance, seemed to carry with it a weight of suspicion. The sealed cabin, once an innocuous structure, had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with their world, a constant reminder that some doors, some secrets, were better left untouched. But for the people of Ashton, it was too late. The mystery surrounding the miners' disappearance, the strange occurrences that followed, and the ancient pact buried beneath the town's history had all come to a head. There was no going back now. The land itself seemed to pulse with an energy that was both ancient and malevolent, and the people of Ashton could feel its grip tightening around them. In the weeks following the unsettling events, the whispers of the miners' voices, the figures seen at the edge of the woods, the town had become fractured. Neighbors who had once been close friends now avoided each other, their faces marked by fear and confusion. The saloon, which had always been a place of comfort, had turned into a battleground of competing theories, where fear and suspicion fueled heated debates. It seemed that everyone had an opinion about what had happened, about the pact that had bound the town to something darker than they had ever imagined. But as much as the townspeople talked, no one had any real answers. The sealed cabin stood as an unsolved puzzle, its secrets locked away beneath the floorboards, and no one, it seemed, was brave enough to open it. Samuel had become more withdrawn in the weeks following his discovery. The journal he had found had provided more questions than answers, and the deeper he delved into it, the more he felt the weight of the town's cursed past pressing down on him. The journal entries of Elias Blackwood, filled with fear and confusion, had painted a picture of a town built on something far darker than anyone had ever realized. But even with all that knowledge, Samuel was no closer to understanding the full extent of what had happened. What exactly was the pact? Who, or what, had the settlers made their deal with? And why had the miners been the ones to uncover the truth? The more Samuel thought about it, the more he began to feel as though the town's fate had been sealed long before the miners had ever stepped foot in the cabin. The deal, made so many years ago, had tied the town to something that had always been there, something that had waited patiently for the right moment to reveal itself. The settlers had believed they could control it, that they could use it to their advantage. But in the end, The land had never been something to be tamed. It had a power all its own, and it had always known when it was time to collect its due. Samuel's growing sense of unease was matched by a strange sense of inevitability. The events that had transpired, the miners' disappearance, the strange figures in the woods, and the whispers that seemed to hang in the air like a bad omen, all seemed to be leading to one place, the sealed cabin. And yet, even with all the evidence pointing in that direction, no one was willing to take the final step. It was as if the very idea of opening the cabin was too much for the townspeople to bear. What could be hidden beneath those floorboards that was so terrible? What had the miners discovered? And what would happen once the truth was revealed? As the days wore on, the town grew quieter, its inhabitants more wary of one another. The strange occurrences continued, but they were now so frequent that they no longer shocked anyone. A door that had been locked would be found wide open in the morning. The sound of footsteps would echo through empty streets, followed by an eerie silence. The nights were worst, long hours of darkness when the very air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. It was as if the land itself had come alive, and it was not content to remain hidden beneath the surface. The night that Clara had heard the voice calling her name from the woods, there had been no moon in the sky, only a thick, oppressive blackness that seemed to swallow the light. Clara had walked home from the store, her heart pounding in her chest as the wind howled through the trees. She had heard the rustling, the whispering wind, and the crackle of leaves underfoot. But then she had heard it, her name, spoken softly, but clearly from the shadows of the woods. She had turned, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. The trees were still, their branches swaying slightly in the wind. And then the voice had come again, this time closer, almost as if it were standing right behind her. She had turned to run, but when she reached her house, she had felt a terrible weight settle over her. It was not just a voice that had unnerved Clara. It was the feeling of being watched, the sensation that something was following her, trailing her every step. When she had reached the safety of her home, she had locked the door behind her, but even then, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was outside, lurking in the shadows, waiting. She had tried to ignore it, to tell herself that it was just the wind, just her imagination, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. The woods, the night, the voice, none of it felt natural. And when she had heard about the strange figure seen standing at the edge of the forest, her heart had dropped. What was happening to Ashton? What had the miners discovered, and why had they paid the price? In the days that followed, more townspeople came forward with similar stories. They had seen the figures too, standing at the edge of the woods, or moving through the fields in the dead of night. The sightings were always brief, just fleeting glimpses of something out of the corner of their eye, but the effect was the same, a deep, paralyzing fear. There was something in the woods, something that didn't belong, and the people of Ashton began to wonder if it was the miners. Had they returned, changed by whatever dark force had taken hold of the town? Were they the ones watching from the trees, waiting for something? But it wasn't just the woods that seemed to be alive. The land itself had become restless, as if something was stirring beneath the surface, something that had been dormant for too long. There were reports of strange lights in the sky, flickering, dancing like flames against the dark horizon. People claimed they had heard deep, rumbling sounds coming from the earth, as if something was moving beneath their feet. And always, there was a sense of being watched, of being drawn towards something that no one could understand. The town had become a place of nightmares, and no one knew how to escape. Samuel was no longer able to keep his discoveries to himself. His growing obsession with the sealed cabin and the Pact had begun to consume him, and he found himself unable to concentrate on anything else. He had become convinced that the key to understanding what had happened to the miners and to the town lay beneath the floorboards of the cabin. He had to know the truth, no matter the cost. But even as he made plans to enter the cabin, to break the seal and uncover whatever lay hidden within, a part of him wondered if it was already too late. The town of Ashton was unraveling, and it seemed that there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The cabin, once a symbol of refuge for miners, had become the focal point of the town's fear and anxiety. It was no longer just a physical structure. It was a representation of the town's darkest secrets, the embodiment of everything that had been buried beneath the surface for so long. And as much as the townspeople tried to ignore it, they couldn't escape the feeling that something was about to happen. The sealed cabin was waiting, and so was whatever it contained. The truth was there, waiting to be uncovered, but the cost of knowledge seemed too high. The land had never been just a place to live. It was a living entity, one that had its own rules, its own demands. The miners had come too close to uncovering the truth, and now they were paying the price. But what about the rest of the town? Could they escape the pull of the land? Could anyone escape its grip once it had been awakened? The sealed cabin held the answers, but what those answers were, no one knew. All they knew was that the truth was there, buried deep beneath the floorboards, waiting for someone to unearth it. And when that truth came to light, there would be no going back. The days stretched on in Ashton, each one feeling longer than the last, as though time itself was slowing to a crawl. The town had become a place of unease, a town on the edge of something that none of its inhabitants fully understood, yet all could feel. The sealed cabin, once a forgotten relic tucked away at the edge of town, had become a focal point of fear and fascination. It was no longer just a building. It was a symbol of the dark forces that had bound the town for generations. And now, it seemed, the time had come for those forces to claim what was owed. Samuel had not been able to shake the growing sense of dread that had taken root in him since he first uncovered Elias Blackwood's journal. The more he read, the more he understood that the town was not simply cursed. It was trapped, bound to a pact made in desperation by men who had long since passed. The journal spoke of the land itself, of something that had existed long before the first settlers had arrived, something ancient and terrible. The settlers, in their desperation for survival, had struck a bargain, a deal that had secured them prosperity and a future, but at a terrible price. It was a price that had been paid in blood, in sacrifices that were made under the cover of darkness, and that price had never truly ended. It was being collected now, and the miners, in their search for riches and knowledge, had unwittingly disturbed something that had been dormant for generations. There was a whisper in the air, a palpable sense of impending doom, that hung over Ashton like a storm cloud. People spoke less, eyes darting nervously around, as though they expected something to happen at any moment. The townspeople had lived in a constant state of fear, but now it was different. It was not just the uncertainty of the miners' disappearance that weighed heavily on them. It was the sense that something had changed. The land was alive, and it was watching them. It was as if the earth itself had become sentient, aware of the people living upon it, and it was waiting for them to make the next move. For the first time, Samuel found himself doubting the wisdom of his pursuit. He had uncovered the truth about the Pact, but that truth had led him to a place where he could no longer see the road ahead clearly. The sealed cabin was more than just a building. It was a threshold, a boundary between two worlds, and the moment that boundary was crossed, there would be no going back. As much as Samuel longed for answers, there was a part of him that feared what those answers might bring. The voices of the miners, their faint, ghostly calls, echoed in his mind, and he wondered if the price had already been paid for his curiosity. And yet, even as the fear began to consume him, Samuel could not stop himself from moving forward. He was driven by something more than just a need for answers. It was a compulsion, a pull that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The sealed cabin had become a riddle, and the solution to that riddle lay buried beneath the floorboards. The journal had hinted at terrible things that no one should have to witness, but had also promised a truth, the kind of truth that could unravel the very fabric of the town's existence. Samuel could not stop now, not when the answers were so close, not when the land seemed to be beckoning him closer, urging him to open the door and face whatever lay behind it. It was an early morning when Samuel decided he could no longer wait. The town was still shrouded in the pale light of dawn, the streets empty save for the occasional early riser. He gathered what few tools he would need, his hands shaking as he collected the items from his study. There was no turning back now, and in that moment, a strange calm settled over him. The town might not yet know the full truth of what lay beneath the sealed floorboards, but Samuel knew it was time for that truth to be revealed. The town had already paid too much in fear and suspicion. It was time to confront the darkness that had taken root in Ashton. As he walked to the cabin, the world seemed unnaturally quiet. The wind had died down, and even the birds had ceased their songs. The silence was oppressive, a heavy, suffocating thing that weighed on his chest. The cabin loomed ahead, dark and imposing against the morning sky. It had always seemed like a forgotten part of the town, hidden away from view, but now it seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, as if the very building was aware of the moment that was about to unfold. Samuel's heart raced in his chest as he approached the door. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the handle, but then, with a deep breath, he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the smell of old wood and earth clinging to the corners of the room. It was colder than he had expected, the temperature dropping as though the walls themselves were absorbing the warmth from the air. The cabin was small, its interior sparsely furnished. The floor was uneven, the wooden planks warped with age, and the walls were lined with shelves that had long been abandoned. There was a fireplace in the corner, its stones cracked and weathered by years of neglect. But it was the floor that drew Samuel's attention. The planks were not like the others. They were newer, more solid, as though they had been installed with great care. And beneath them, hidden in the shadow of the walls, lay the secret that had been buried for so long. Samuel knelt beside the floorboards, his hands trembling as he pried them loose. The wood creaked and groaned in protest, but finally the boards gave way, revealing a small, shallow cavity beneath. It was empty, save for a small wooden chest, its surface worn and scratched by time. The chest seemed almost ordinary, unremarkable in its appearance, but there was something about it that made Samuel's heart race. He had expected something, but not this simple box locked away so carefully. It was as though it had been waiting for him, waiting for someone to come and open it, to release whatever it contained. With a deep breath, Samuel lifted the chest from its hiding place and set on the floor before him. The lock was old, rusted with age, but it was sturdy. He fumbled for a moment, the key slipping from his fingers, but then, with a final twist, the lock gave way. He opened the chest slowly, the hinges creaking as the lid rose. Inside, he found not treasure or riches, but something far darker. Pages yellowed and brittle, covered in strange symbols and indecipherable writing. The pages seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, as though they were alive, as though they were calling to him. The truth was here, and it was more than Samuel had ever imagined. These were the words of Elias Blackwood, the man whose journal had led him here. But they were not just words. They were a record of the pact, a pact that had been sealed with blood and with promises that no one had ever truly understood. The words on the pages were not just a history. They were instructions on how to keep the pact alive, on how to feed the land and keep the darkness at bay. And in the center of the chest, there was a final page, a page that had been torn from a larger book. It was covered in strange markings, symbols that seemed to move as Samuel looked at them, as though they were alive, as though they were waiting for something. And beneath the markings, written in a scrawling hand, was a single sentence: "The price must be paid." Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he read the words. He had always suspected that the town's prosperity had come at a cost, but it was more than he could have ever imagined. The pact was not just about the land. It was about power, about control over something far darker, something that had existed long before the settlers had ever arrived. The price that had been paid was not just a sacrifice of life. It was a binding of the town to something ancient, something that could never be undone. Samuel closed the chest, his hands shaking as he backed away from it. The weight of the knowledge was suffocating, and for the first time he felt a deep, overwhelming sense of dread. The truth had been revealed, but at what cost? The town of Ashton was tied to something far darker than anyone could have known, and it was not something that could be escaped. The pact had been made, and it had to be honored. There was no way out. As Samuel stood there, staring at the chest, a cold realization settled over him. The town was already lost. The price had already been paid, and whatever darkness had been set in motion so long ago was now here, waiting to claim what was owed, and there was no going back. The discovery in the cabin had shattered something in Samuel, something deep and fundamental, as if the very fabric of his understanding had been torn apart. The truth, so long buried and hidden from view, had finally been revealed, but the weight of it was unbearable. He stood there, in the dim light of the sealed cabin, holding the ancient chest, feeling the cold presence of whatever dark force had been lurking beneath the town for generations. The town of Ashton was not a simple, sleepy place. It was a town tied to an ancient power, a pact that had been forged long ago and had shaped every aspect of the lives of those who lived there. That pact had claimed the lives of the miners, and now, it seemed, it was preparing to claim more. Samuel's mind raced as he tried to process everything that had been uncovered. The journal, the chest, the cryptic symbols. Everything pointed toward one undeniable truth. The town of Ashton was bound to something far darker than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just the land that had been cursed. It was the town itself, its people, its very existence. The pact, sealed in blood and sacrifice, had made it so that the town could never truly be free. The price had already been paid, and the darkness, which had once slumbered beneath the earth, was now awakening. As Samuel stood there, the chest closed tightly in his hands, he realized that what he had uncovered wasn't just a secret of the past. It was a living, breathing force, one that had been feeding on the town's prosperity for generations. And it was not done yet. The miners had made the mistake of uncovering it. They had disturbed something ancient, something that was never meant to be disturbed. And in doing so, they had set the stage for something far worse than their disappearance. They had become pawns in a game that had been played for centuries, and now, with the truth of the pact in his hands, Samuel felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? How could he, one man, hope to stand against something so vast, so old, so insidious? The first thing Samuel knew he had to do was leave the cabin. The air felt thick around him, suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on him. The unease that had been growing within him for weeks now felt like a physical weight. It wasn't just the cabin. It was the town itself. Ashton had become a place where the line between the living and the dead was growing increasingly thin, and every breath Samuel took felt like an intrusion into a reality that was no longer his own. The sealed cabin had opened a door, one that he could not close again, and whatever was on the other side was not going to let them forget. As he made his way back toward town, the streets of Ashton seemed different, darker, more oppressive. The sunlight that had once filtered through the trees, casting warm shadows on the ground, now seemed pale and cold. The wind that blew through the trees no longer carried the sounds of birds or animals. It was silent, empty, as though nature itself had withdrawn from the town. Every step Samuel took felt heavy, as if the earth itself was resisting him, as if it knew that the secret had been revealed and that nothing would ever be the same again.